Hi students, we're going to be talking about lesson 4.04, the energy flow in ecosystems. So here's a general overview of what we'll be looking at today. We're going to be starting with the sun's energy and looking at how that allows producers to make their own energy, and then how consumers get their own energy from those producers. And remember, consumers are going to be organisms that have to eat or consume other organisms in order to obtain energy. Some examples of consumers that we're going to look at are herbivores, and those are consumers that eat plants. And then we also have carnivores, which are organisms that eat other animals or insects. But before we go into that, we need to go over some of the basics. One of the most important things you need to know is that all organisms need energy to survive. So all living things or organisms require a consistent source of energy to survive. For example, if you think of how much energy you need to survive, you probably eat something multiple times a day, and that's so that you have that consistent source of energy throughout the day. So in this lesson, we're going to be looking at an ecosystem in Texas and explore the unique ecosystem there. There are different plants and insects and other types of organisms that are present there, and even though they're all unique, they all have one thing in common, which is that they all need energy. The thing that they differ in is that they all differ in how they obtain their energy. So if we start from the beginning, we can look at a process called photosynthesis that we've talked about before. Remember, photosynthesis is when we take energy from the sun and we make it into energy that can be used by living things. This type of energy is what we call glucose. Okay, so plants undergo photosynthesis so they can take energy from the sun and make it into glucose. Once we make that glucose, it can be converted into a usable chemical form, which we call ATP. And that's in a process called cellular respiration. Okay, so once we have that ATP, then what we can do is we can pass on that usable energy from one organism to the next. And that's kind of how energy gets passed through organisms in an ecosystem. So let's start with producers. So producers make their own food and are the source of all energy used in the ecosystem. So they're the foundation of the ecosystem. And what we mean by they make their own food is that they use the process of photosynthesis, because remember, they can take the energy from the sun and make it into a usable energy for themselves. So in the ecosystem in Texas, there's a cacti that is present, and this cactus would also undergo photosynthesis where they make glucose. Again, photosynthesis is when we take energy from the sun and convert it into glucose through a process called photosynthesis. Another word that we can use for producers is autotroph. Auto means self, and troph means nourishing. So if we take the word autotroph and we put self and nourishing together, it means that it nourishes itself. So this cactus, its main job is to really produce energy right through photosynthesis, but in order to pass on that energy, there needs to be some organisms that consume it. So even though it doesn't look like there would be any organisms on the cactus, if we were to look closely, we would see this cactus moth caterpillar. And this cactus moth caterpillar is uniquely adapted to this environment where it is able to feed on the cactus. And so here we see a consumer right? A consumer, an organism that eats another organism that is eating a producer. So if we have animals that eat plants or producers, we call them primary consumers. Another name for a plant eater would be an herbivore. Okay, so we talked about producers and we introduced the concept of consumers. And basically, the definition for consumers is that any organism that obtains energy by eating other organisms. So if we look in that Texas ecosystem, in the mouth of the Bracken Cave, we would see something like this, and you see lots and lots of bats. And so what you see here are bats that actually eat moths. Okay, so we have plants, right? Plants transfer energy to moths, right? And so we call the plants the producer because it's producing its own energy. We call moths the primary consumer because it eats the plants. And then we have bats. And bats are the ones that eat the moths. So moths are going to be transferring energy to the bats, and we call them secondary consumers because they are the ones that eat herbivores. So bats are called secondary consumers. Okay, so now let's look at the energy flow in an ecosystem. So an ecosystem contains many different types of producers, again, organisms that make their own energy, and many different consumers, organisms that consume other organisms. So for example, in the ecosystem that we just looked at in that cave, there are baby bats, and in some cases, baby bats can fall to the ground, making them susceptible to different predators. And so what you see here is that this baby bat can then be eaten by a snake. So because the snake is eating a bat, we would call that a tertiary or third level consumer. So again, we look at plants, which are producers. Then we have moths that eat the plants, so we call them the primary consumer. Then we have bats that eat the moths, so we call those secondary consumers. And then we have snakes, which we call the tertiary consumers. Okay, so there are many different levels, and within those levels, there are many different organisms that occupy the role of producer, primary, secondary, and tertiary consumer. So we have this thing called a scientists organize ecosystem into levels called trophic levels based on how energy flows through the organisms in the system. And so what trophic levels are basically a different way that scientists will organize the different organisms based on how and what organisms eat and obtain their energy. So in this in a numbers pyramid specifically, what we're looking at is how many organisms are present at each trophic level. So we're looking at population size. So what we see here is down here, if we were to look at the prickly pear cactus, we see that there are a lot of producers, right? Out of the entire pyramid that you see right here, definitely there are the most producers. Then if we go up a trophic level, we see we have some primary consumers. And remember, we talked about that moth caterpillar that feed on the cactus. And you can see that these are herbivores and that they only make up a fraction of how many producers there are. And then next we have the secondary consumers. And the secondary consumers, remember, feed on the primary consumers. And we have the Mexican free-tailed bats that do that. And compared to the, the caterpillar, we see that it only makes up a fraction of their population. So in the same pattern, we have the least amount of tertiary consumers. And remember, the tertiary consumers was the rat snake, the ones that fed on the bats. And so as you see, as we go up each trophic level, there is only a fraction of this population size as the previous trophic level. So that was the numbers pyramid. If we look at the energy pyramid, we can look at the amount of available energy at each trophic level. So there's actually a 90% loss of energy that occurs when you move up each trophic level. So for example, if we go from producers to primary consumers, there's only 10% available to the next trophic level. That means that the other 90% is used up by the organism or lost as heat. And so as we go up each trophic level, we only transfer 10% of what was available at the previous trophic level. So now that we know the available energy and also the population sizes, we can kind of see how those two things are related to one another. Okay, so because there is a decreasing amount of energy available at each trophic level as you go up the pyramid, the number of individuals has to decrease as well. Okay, so obviously there are many different species that are producers and consumers. There's not just one type at every single trophic level. So because we have different organisms that are in the same trophic level, there is some level of competition for food at every single trophic level. For example, the falcon is a tertiary consumer just like the rat snake. So that means that they're probably competing for similar organisms because they occupy the same trophic level. Because the amount of energy reaching the tertiary level is small, there really can't be more tertiary consumers than there are primary or secondary consumers, because the primary and secondary consumers are the ones that are fueling the tertiary consumers. So although you might think of a falcon or a snake being the top predators that dominate an ecosystem, really the ecosystem is not dependent on them, but are dependent on the trophic levels below them, specifically the producers, who are the source of all the energy present in an ecosystem. Okay, and we also have organisms that act as decomposers and also detrivores. And what their jobs are is that they break down or recycle dead organisms into usable nutrients. And those usable nutrients will go back into the soil to allow for those producers to continue to make energy from the sun's energy. Okay, so if we go back to the example of the bats, remember that there are always those young bats that cluster in the cave, and sometimes those young bats will unfortunately fall to the ground, and because they don't have any means of protecting themselves or defending themselves because they're not able to just yet, what will happen are decomposers will actually and detrivores will come in and break down either the dying bats or the dead bats. Okay, so detrivores are animals such as earthworms, dung beetles, and some roaches, and they eat dead material such as decaying leaves or dead animals. Decomposers are the ones that eat very little of the dead material, but really their main goal is to break down the chemicals so that it can be recycled back into the environment like the soil. Okay, so those types of organisms would be things like bacteria and some fungi. So as you can see, the detrivores and the decomposers, they really interact with dead or dying organisms. And because all organisms like leaves die, bats die, snakes die, all of those at different trophic levels, detrivores and decomposers are going to be involved in all trophic levels. We also have scavengers and parasites, and scavengers and parasites really make things a little bit more complicated to energy flow. And the reason why is because they're not your traditional consumer. So for example, if you look closely at the fur of bats, you would see mites. And mites are spider-like parasites that feed on the bat blood. So the mites are going to live off of the bat, but they're not actually going to kill or consume the bat. So it's kind of tricky to know where they would lie in the energy pyramid. We also have organisms like the turkey vulture, and the turkey vulture is actually a scavenger. And or we can also call it a detrivore because it feeds on dead or decaying organisms. The vulture has an exceptional sense of smell that can help it locate a carcass from miles away. So again, it's eating a dead or dying organism. So you can see here, this is a tick on a cheek of a bird, and that's a parasite because it is feeding on the organism, but it's actually not benefiting the organism, but it's at the expense of that host organism. Okay, so as you can see, sometimes it's hard to really categorize an organism in just one way. It's difficult to call an organism strictly carnivores, like it only eats other animals and insects, or even strictly scavengers. There are many detrivores like the roach and turkey vulture that will not only feed on dead organisms but can actually feed on weak and dying ones. So you can call it a carnivore in one sense or detrivore in another. There are also animals such as bears and humans that will actually feed on plants and animals. So instead of just calling them herbivore or carnivore, we can call them omnivores. So based on what they're eating, omnivores would fit into different trophic levels, right? Because herbivores are primary consumers because they eat plants. But if you eat plants and animals, then where exactly would you fit? So obviously it's not as black and white as it might have been presented here. Okay, and then we want to talk about the stability of an ecosystem. So kind of what organisms allow for ecosystems to remain stable and allow the energy flow to continue throughout the ecosystem. And so the stability of the ecosystem really relies on producers and decomposers. Without producers, no new energy would be fed into the system because remember, we have producers that are responsible for photosynthesis. And if there weren't any producers, then energy would run out pretty quickly. The stability of populations of producers and many key consumers are really the basis for a strong, healthy ecosystem. If for any reason the population of producers was severely decreased, then the stability of the ecosystem would definitely be weakened. So here's a summary of what we went over today. Remember, we look at how producers are capturing that energy from sunlight, and then we looked at how all the other consumers get their energy ultimately from those producers. So remember, we have primary consumers that get their energy from producers. We have secondary consumers that get their energy from primary consumers. And then we also, remember, have those tertiary consumers that get their energy from secondary consumers. All of these trophic levels can be affected by parasites. Remember, organisms that get energy from another organism without eating or consuming that organism. And there are other organisms called detrivores and scavengers that eat on dying or dead organisms. And another role that they play is that they break down and recycle that back into the environment. And those are called decomposers. So remember, when they put it back into the environment, we're putting nutrients into the soil. So again, here, this is kind of a simplistic view where we go from sun's energy producers to consumers. And then we have herbivores and carnivores. We also talked about omnivores, right? And we also talked about detrivores. Okay, so here's some important vocabulary. We have producers that are organisms that produce glucose from sun energy. We have consumers, an organism that eats another organism. We have trophic level, which is again the producing or feeding level in a food chain. We have numbers pyramid, which is a graphical representation of the total number of organisms or the population present at each trophic level of an ecosystem. And then we have the energy pyramid, which is similar to the numbers pyramid, but what we're looking at is the amount of chemical energy present at each trophic level of an ecosystem.